Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a tag video. This is the Brandon Sanderson Tag. I have no idea who Brandon Sanderson is. I was tagged by Brian over at Bookish, and when I watched his video, or as I started to watch his video, I thought, Brian, what have you done to me here? You know, this is a fantasy author, but actually the questions are really good questions, and though they sort of spring off fantasy themes, the questions themselves are pucker, so I was quite happy to do this in the end. Prompt 1. Brandon wrote many early novels while working as a night clerk at a Provo hotel. Is that Provo, Utah? Isn't that where the Mormons have their university? Long story, I won't get into it. What book kept you reading late into the night? Well, I can't actually think of any. That doesn't mean that there haven't been books that have kept me reading, trying to get to the end, but not late through the night, which I know is a literal interpretation of this prompt, for the simple reason I can't read late to that. As an insomniac, my eyes just get so heavy. I very rarely read beyond 10 o'clock at night, just because I can't, as I say, I can't keep my eyes open, which you'd think is a good thing, because it should help precipitate sleep, but it's a bit more complicated than that, and unfortunately it doesn't. But plenty of books that I've been gripped by and read through to the end. 2. Brandon's complex magic systems. Yeah, that was the point at which I was filled with dread at this at this tag, but it's okay. Set his fantasy apart. What subject do you love to read about in all of its complexity? Well, I think most of the fiction I read deals with the complexity of the subject I'm most interested in, which is fiction and reality. It's what I write, it's what I obsess about. Every day I think about the nature of our reality, and obviously I think about the nature of fiction as a fiction writer. So most books that do justice to the subjects. So I like fiction books that reflect on their own fictive nature, or acknowledge their own fictive nature, to which I mean they don't ask the readers to suspend their belief, because they point to the reader that this is only a book. Now that can be done very badly as well, but when it's done well, there's nothing like it. So writers like Ben Marcus, David Marks and people like that. 3. Brandon gets book ideas from watching other storytellers fail to execute a concept well. I really like that. He figures out how to do it better. What 2 books handle the same concept in strikingly different ways, and which did you prefer? Well, this year I read 2 books about siege situations. This, Bel Canto by Anne Pratchett, was set in Peru, although it's never named as such, and is not Sendero Luminoso, who are a Maoist Year Zero Marxist group. Because as is mentioned in here, if it had been, then there wouldn't have been a siege situation. They just would have wiped everybody out. And I would contrast it to a book that's been managed to my shed, Monique Roffey's House of Ashes, which is also about a siege situation, this time in Trinidad, based on true events. That they were political sieges, you know, that they were terrorist groups or guerrilla groups, let's say, who had a sort of list of demands, and both sort of devolved into long, stretched out sieges. And they were quite similar in that respect. But what lifted this one above the Roffey was the characters. There were some really interesting characters. And in a way, though the sieges were sort of obviously the framing of both novels, it was in this more than the Roffey, but this particularly was about the characters. And those characters could have been set against some other situation that wasn't a siege, but you know, one is an opera singer, and the other was a Japanese businessman. Whereas in the Monique Roffey, the characters there were talking about politics in a much more sort of unvarnished way. Here it was much more subtle. So I infinitely preferred the treatment in Bel Canto than I did to House of Ashes. 4. Child Brandon was recommended several books about dogs that die. As a result, he became a reluctant reader. Please share a formative good or bad childhood reading experience. Well, I was a reluctant reader because I didn't read books at all till I was about 14, because I was too busy in the garden and the park playing sports. But the book that got me into reading was this, Albert Camus' The Outsider. And I was recommended this book by an older cousin of mine who went to the same school as I did. And he said, listen to the song by The Cure called Killing an Arab and then read this book, because The Cure's first album was quite heavily influenced by this book. Both Killing an Arab and Fire in Cairo sort of derived from this book. So, you know, I listened to the song, loved the song, then read the book. I was absolutely blown away by the book, because it's a great existentialist novel. And at that time, age 14, existentialism seemed to give me some illumination in the world about one's own being, given that I wasn't a person of faith. And a bad experience, well, I did English to A level, which, if you don't know, if you're not from the UK, is the sort of last set of exams you do at high school. So you do them at age 17, 18. And I did English literature. And yet up to that point, I'd managed never to read a Dickens, a Hardy, you know, nothing from the classical Victorian canon. But there's no escaping it for A level, obviously. And the book that we did was Jane Austen's Emma. And I hated it. Not just because the teaching of it was awful, which doesn't help, but it just didn't speak to me at all. I didn't care. I wasn't, you know, all that intrigue about relationships. You know, as great as the voice is, as supreme a stylist as Jane Austen is, it just seemed utterly irrelevant to my life. And I'm afraid, you know, to this day, I've still read barely anything from the Victorian canon. I'm not a Victorian canon reader, so I won't be participating in Jane Austen July for obvious reasons. Yeah, sorry. 5. Brandon and several friends host the Writing Excuses podcast, and they frequently invite guests. Please tell us about a collaborative fiction project and what you thought of it. Well, I've actually got several. The first is, I think, should be the answer of everyone, which is Watchmen, which is Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And if this isn't on your answer for this question, it must mean you haven't read it. Obviously, graphic novel, artist and author. The next is Anatomy Courses by Blake Buckler and Sean Kilpatrick, which is a great little novel. Blake Buckler writes he's insomniac, as I am, but it seems to affect his brain chemistry differently. He writes these really disturbing and unnerving novels. This is slightly more reined in, possibly because it's a collaboration. But it's a really good book. It seems to be, I mean, it's never sort of, you know, stated out, you know, definitively, but it seems to be from the point of view of a developing fetus inside the mother, peeping out through the navel of the mother. And there's lots of stuff about sort of small windows and holes, and which just makes the perspective and therefore the language of description very, very interesting. And then 2 that I no longer own. One fell victim to my mould. I don't know what happened to the other one. The first is the husband and wife team who wrote the Martin Beck series, who are Maj, Solwell and Per Wallu, because I can't imagine a husband and wife team writing anything. But, you know, I've only read the final one in that series. That was kind of enough to give me a flavour. And very good it was too. But just the concept of, I can't get my head around that at all. And the other is a similar collaboration in some sense between Jeff Noon and, I can't remember who he collaborated with, called Mapalujo, where basically they wrote down a list of artists and singers, ballet dancers, anyone who's been anyone in the arts, basically, in the modern world. And they would, draw them out of a hat. And they would write alternate chapters. And it was a proper science fiction fantasy novel. But they had to... Each chapter was headed by, say, 8 of the names that they'd plucked out of the hat, and each section of the 4 sections, and each chapter would be one of those names that they'd picked out of that. So they'd have to write it in such a way that pointed to that artist or their work, and it's brilliant because it's still a seamless novel. You know, even if you didn't have that element, it works as a novel. But because it's got all this extra sort of cultural stuff on top, it's just a work of genius. So that's it for collaborations. Brandon's first book, White Sand Prime, was rewritten and eventually converted into a graphic novel called White Sands. What book would you like to see in another format? Well, for me, it's any polyphonic novel multi-voiced that I would like to either hear as a radio play or as some sort of sound installation. So where you could basically shut your eyes and just have these voices. So one book example will be GB84 by David Peace, but there are loads of other polyphonic voice novels. And if I'm being slightly snarky, there are two science fiction novels that I would like to see written as novels, by which I mean they were both basically lectures. They were the author just laying down their ideas, and they're fantastic. Well, one is Stanislaw Lem's His Master's Voice, which is just a brilliant set of ideas, but it's, you know, there's a crisis facing Earth out in the galaxy, and all these scientists get together to try and resolve it. And it's just Lem laying down all these different theories of one scientist's advance and another counters and another advances. But it's not a novel. It's just it's like a lecture, despite the brilliance of the ideas. And the other is sort of similar in the only bad book I've ever read by Viktor Pelevin, the Russian author, called Empire 5, The Prince of Hamlet, which is a book about two young Russians who get bitten by vampires and therefore they go into vampire training school. And again, it's just Pelevin just doing this at you, just, you know, lecturing you. Again, some great ideas contained in it. It's, you know, about the sort of state of modern Russia and its lack of morals and how it's all been corrupted by money. But it's not a novel. It is literally a lecture series given to these two trainee vampires. It's dreadful. It's not a novel. So I'd like to see both those books rewritten as novels. 7. Brandon writes very quickly. What prolific author or authors would you recommend? Well, two really. Jeremy Leatham and Dave Eggers. I don't think there's anyone as prolific as Dave Eggers. I'd say Leatham is a better writer. Eggers is more hit and miss. So I've just pulled out the two, my favourites for each author. Jonathan Lethem, Chronic City, which is just a wonderful, slightly offbeat stoner's novel. And the other is Your Fathers, Where Are They? And the Prophets, Do They Live Forever? Which is a great romp. I actually read this in one day. I was going to a friend's 60th birthday party, and I was meeting my wife to go to it, and I had 2 hours, because I'd come from somewhere, I can't remember, to get there. So I went into a bookshop in the local shopping centre, bought this, read most of it before the party, and made sure I finished it off as soon as I could. And it's very funny. It's about a guy who is mentally disturbed, who keeps having these sort of existential questions he asks himself, and then goes and kidnaps people from his past life, his childhood, and you know, who he thinks are going to help him answer these questions. It's slightly disturbing, but it's actually very good and very funny. Brandon's Cosmere Universe books are grounded in Platonic philosophy. What book or series gets you really excited about the source material? Okay, so for me, it's this book, The Seventh Functional Language by Laurent Binet. If you don't know, if you can't tell behind the title, that is Roland Barthes, the French semiologist and sort of literary critic. And this book starts off with his death, which really happened. He was hit by a milk float, a delivery van, a dry cleaning delivery van, and died from his injuries without ever regaining consciousness. And this book is the assumption that in his possession when he got hit was this manuscript that detailed how to basically argue so that you would just win over everyone to your argument. It's a sort of a way of sort of delivering, rhetorical argument. And then it becomes a whole great sort of, chase to try and recoup this document. And it's all about semiology and semiotics. It has lots of real life semioticians and philosophers like Derrida and Jacobson and who's the guy who killed his wife, which is also in here. The French state, because he was an academic, the French state bundled him into sort of a mental hospital to keep him out of jail. I can't remember his name, but all these are very famous sort of French academics. You don't need to know anything about them or their theories because they're treated as the sort of fallible human beings here. It's very funny, but it's also chock full of the ideas involved. It's brilliant. And, I've never studied semiotics, but, I really appreciated what had gone into this book. Brandon loves to show multiple sides of every issue and to contrast character values. Please share a book that handles controversy well. So there's a couple, really. I read this year, Minor Detail, by the Palestinian writer Adania Shibli. It's a book divided into two halves. The first is from the viewpoint of an Israeli colonel who's been asked to secure the border in 1948, the Sinai, for the Egyptians. And he suffers an insect bite, which basically completely unravels him during the course of his half of the book. So that he's a man who's obsessed by military discipline and order of everything, and all of that comes apart as he gets sort of slightly more hallucinogenic, really. And the discipline of his men under his control goes to pot as well. And a young Arab woman is captured and raped. That is the first half of the book. The second half is 25 years later, from the point of view of a Palestinian woman who notices a one-line reference to that history in a newspaper article, and then goes on the trail of uncovering more. But because she's Palestinian, it's really difficult for her, and all the challenges that she faces, just getting through border crossings, and every time there's a road stop, is she going to be challenged to have her papers confiscated, all of that. But it's actually pretty even-handed, and not only that, but they share. There's everyday objects that appear in both halves of the story that have very different resonances. That is the subtlety of the book. So, for example, the woman manages to get a room in a hotel in Israel, i.e. outside the occupied territories, and she turns the shower on, and she realises that it's unlimited hot water, which she doesn't have back in where she's from, where the water is always limited, and if you're selfish and you use a lot of it, it means there's less for your kith and kin. And it's just a very subtle but evenly handled book, I feel, on what is always a controversy, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And slightly similar, but not entirely, is Milkman, Anna Burns. This is another sort of sectarian divide, this time between obviously Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. And Burns handles it brilliantly because it's so literary, this novel. It's so, from its style and its structure and its language, it's only, all the stuff about the division and the conflict in Northern Ireland is handled through language, the difference of language, how even your name can portray which community you're from. And, if you're in the wrong community, you can suffer the consequences. It's just brilliantly done. Lastly, Brandon Sanderson is a writing teacher, and unlike some writing teachers, he posts his lectures online for free. What free literature resource are you grateful for? Well, as a writer, I'm grateful for freedictionary.com, more for its, obviously as a dictionary function, but also as a thesaurus, because words are my bag. I do have dictionaries in hard copy, but I very rarely resort to them because that's a great resource. But in terms of as a reader, I don't really have any decent resources. But one thing I will say is this year I downloaded a free copy of Evan Dara's book called Provisional Biography of Moser Eakins. And Evan Dara wrote The Lost Scrapbook, and he's a bit like Pynchon and Salinger. He's anonymous. No one really knows his identity. And I love the Lost Scrapbook, but this was even better. It's written as a stage play. It's never meant to be performed as a stage play. That is his artistic decision for the form of this book. And again, it's about sort of loss of language. So it starts off with this guy, he's sort of middle management in an office, and he walks on stage and he's fielding all these different conversations with different members of the office. Some are social, some are professional. How was your weekend? Or I need this report, or have you done this report? All that sort of stuff. But gradually you realise all these different conversations he's having, all these different sort of meters and tenors, is about his own language not being understood. So he hears what he wants to say. When he speaks, he hears it exactly as it's meant to be said, exactly what he means to deliver, but no one else can understand him. they're hearing something completely different. And gradually this dawns on him and how he handles it. The only people who hear him exactly, one is his girlfriend. She's not hearing him exactly, but they have enough of a non-verbal communicative system through being, you know, partners, that she can understand his meaning. And the other is someone who sells him food every day from a stall. And it's sort of implied that when there's a commercial transaction involved, his language works, because it's a universal language. We all, you know, transact, we all speak and we transact in order for us to have things like food and all that sort of stuff. So that guy, the stallholder, is the only guy who can understand him. So it's like a sort of a corruption of language through commerce. And it's a brilliant, you know, it's only about 80, 90 pages, but it's a fantastic, and it's free. So I really recommend you go and download it. So those are all the prompts. Thanks very much to Brian at Bookish. I will post the link to the original poster. I think she's called Dostoevsky's Bookshelf. Okay, till next time. Thanks very much.